she recognized her son after so many years. Earlier, she used to keep asking people that about her son's whereabouts, but it was so difficult because the son that she had lost 13 years ago would have now transformed into a young adult, a young man, and it was difficult to identify that person after so many years have passed by. So Rachel fortunately recognizes Henry because of the scar that he has on his forehead, and the story ends with the reunion of the mother and the son. So there's a happy ending. Happy to what extent? Because the longingness to be able to meet your child, to reunite with your lost child, that is served. But it is only later on that such kind of stories have had a lot of impact, and it has brought about social change by abolishing slavery. So Mark Twain has contributed socially as well as politically through his writings by bringing about these changes and sensitizing people about the unfortunate happenings that were taking place in America in the name of slavery. Now this is how the story goes about, but we have to discuss a true story as a short story, and we'll have to look at it, look at the technicalities of the story, the style that the author has used. We look at the characters and what they stand for, and what are the most important things that catch the reader within the story. So when we talk about style and techniques, as I told you earlier, he has used a very different technique here by alternating the voices of two narrators. You have Mr. C, and that could be the author himself, and Aunt Rachel. These are the two narrators. One is narrating the story about how this Negro woman is always cheerful. He begins the story by talking about Aunt Rachel and her cheerful nature, and then onwards it is that Mr. C, the author himself, it's a question mark, but then there is a clear kind of indication that Mr. C stands for Clemens, and it is also mentioned that one of the summers when author had been and he'd met Mary Ann, who told him about the story, and that is probably what inspired him. So it's actually a true story according to Mark Twain, and therefore he is very aptly given the title of a true story to this particular story. Mr. C provides the frame to the story. If we look at it, if we look at the technique that has been used, Mr. C, he provides a frame to the story, and the main story of a true story is narrated to the readers by Aunt Rachel. When we look at the ending of the story, whether it has a happy ending or not, it does, the position of Aunt Rachel at the beginning of the story, when she's seated below the master, and then slowly, gradually, when she's narrating, she feels so superior that she slowly stands up, because despite all this, her moral strength hasn't weakened a bit. So the relative moral position of the characters are also reversed here. So somebody who's sitting at the beginning of the story is, who's a little at a upper level has to come down, and the person who's sitting as a subordinate raises up because the character is elevated. There is a reversal, and the relative moral position of the characters are reversed, and that is the strength of the story. Now when we use of the realist African American dialect, is another highlight of the story. Most of the narration is made by Aunt Rachel in a very unaffected voice, and therefore it becomes very, very important that the author has to use the particular dialect used by the African American people. The author's strength, you can see, is the ear and ability to render it accurately. He has done it so well that we feel as if a real Negress woman is writing the story, and because the words coming out, the language that is used in the story is not of a white. Use of Southern black dialects is the highlight of the story again. We look at the themes, as I said earlier. You will find that there's this autobiographical element in the story. The essence of this tale is a true story. He heard the story from Mary Ann near Elmira, New York, where he had gone to spend his summers. The concerns of human endurance in the face of terrible personal loss is another theme, is a theme of the story. So how much can a person endure? Here you find Aunt Rachel, that her husband, somebody who loved and who was very affectionate towards her, was snatched away from her because he was sold at the auction, like all the other blacks were being sold for slavery. And this endurance, and having 7 children and not having even one with the mother, can anything be more painful than that? So this concerns for human endurance in the face of terrible personal loss is the major theme that you can find in this story. Something that highlights us, bring our attention, is about the strength and cheerfulness of Aunt Rachel. You can see that she not once has the narrator, the author or the first narrator has ever found her weeping or sobbing or complaining or groaning about anything. There's so much of positivity in her that she laughs all the time, and laughter for her is as natural as the birds sing. How does a woman feel when she's separated from her dear ones? Separation from a loving and affectionate husband and all her 7 children is how the story, as it moves, it talks about the anguish, the pain experienced by Aunt Rachel. It's a mother's anguish, it's a wife's anguish, and there is a tale of revelation to a white person. The best part is, by introducing these 2 narrators, Mark Twain has made it very interesting, because it becomes a tale of revelation where a black woman is talking about her anguish to a white person. Now, African American slaves too share similar feelings of love and devotion as the white. I would certainly like to read out something from this story where Aunt Rachel says that she too had a loving husband, and she says her children, she had a very normal household, like with a very loving and affectionate husband and extremely loving children. But then how she has to undergo this separation. So it's not that whites have more feelings or blacks have less feeling. It's one and the same, because human beings, irrespective of the color of the skin, have to undergo the same kind of feelings when they lose their dear ones. This is the message that Mark Twain wanted to express or exhibit through this story. The true depiction of the treatment meted out to blacks before the American Civil War. That is something which he's highlighted in this entire story. And African American language is the highlight of the story. The entire narration by Aunt Rachel uses a kind of English which is not English. It's an African American language. And some of the words that are used here, would like to discuss these words so that while you read the text, you can actually understand what the narrator is trying to say, because they sound so different. It becomes so difficult for an English reader to read the story because of the colloquial language or the dialects of the African American that is used here. Honest here, which means earnest, it is sincere. Born, when he says what she meant was born, B-O-R-N. Sa, it's for sir. And themselves, when she says. So there's a lot of grammatical errors in the language that you find, and it's deliberate on the part of Mark Twain to highlight, to make it realistic to the readers. Themselves means themselves. Niggers is, as we all know, it's used for the Negro community, general. Auction is for auction, and Richmond for Richmond, the capital of Commonwealth of Virginia. Blubbering is a sobbing noisily. Mouth is used for mouth. Tetches means takes. Going, it says going to. In order to say going to, it says going. And hain't, have not. Vow for war, and master for master. Monstrous for monstrous, something very big. General, afeared for afraid. Friends, so you'll find that the der sound is silent here in most of the, so it's friends. North for north, and curtsy for, curtsy means curtsy. You know, it's a gesture of respect that is used. And skyar, when she says, what she actually meant was scar. The scar on the forehead of Henry when she uses this. South for south. Nothing for nothing. Soldier for soldier. Just for just. Morning for morning. Da for there. Flow for flow. Dander, which is a very informal kind of a word which is used here, especially when one loses one's temper, this word is used, and it's a very informal word which has been used here. Now when we look at the highlights of the story, it's very important to understand how the story is being built up brick by brick. The story, as we have the opening of the story, or the introduction as we call it, where the narrator prompting Rachel to relate her story, because just by telling her that she has no sadness in her life, there is nothing that has ever made her sad in life, and she's prompted to react to that thing, and that's how she starts narrating her story. Aunt Rachel's memories of her mother is very important here when she talks about her mother. I'd just like to read that. She says that she's from Virginia. Virginia is used for Virginia. Well, sir, I was raised in old Virginia, I'm sorry. But my mother, she was raised in Maryland. And my souls, she was terrible when she'd get started, my land. But she'd made me fly. When she'd get into tantrums. So her mother used to get into tantrums. She always had one word that she used to repeatedly say. How would she do that? She'd straighten herself up and put her fists in her hips and say, I want you to understand that I want born in the mash to be fooled by trash. I's one of the old blue hen's chickens. I is, she says. She says, I'm from, because she came from Maryland, she thought herself quite superior, and she was raised in Maryland, so she's sort of trying to say. Now, this memories of her mother, which Aunt Rachel narrates to Mr. C, is something to be taken note of. And that there is a kind of a self-pride in this character. Then the most important highlight when we talk about slavery and anti-slavery and abolition of slavery, the only thing is like what touches anyone is the auction. We have heard of auction where things are being sold, old things are sold, cattle are sold, but this is about the auction where human beings are sold. And these are the blacks, the Negroes are being sold. And this auction is one of the highlight, how it is described by Rachel. It's actually described by Mark Twain through the character of Rachel as she narrates about the auction. Now, Rachel's reaction to the auctioneers taking away her youngest son. So she starts reacting when one after the other, her husband and her children were being taken away, were being sold off. But she somehow sort of mustered courage. But it was a limit when all her limits, she had to, it was all her tolerance had evaporated by the time she saw that youngest son, Henry, was being sold. She was so pained, he was too small, and it was beyond her ability to control her anger, and she reacts. She gets to cook for the officers, Rachel. Now that is another highlight of the story, where the only thing that slaves are made to do different kinds of tasks. But here Aunt Rachel has all the while, through the story you come to know that she was always a cook for the officers. And later on, to at the place of Mr. C also, she has been a cook. So officer's response to Rachel when she asks about Henry, that's another highlight, where when these officers come, right, the unions, when the unions took the town and the officers come every time when she asks about her son's whereabouts, the officer's response is very, very significant. It's on page number 92. And they say that, when did you lose your son? You lost